So I was raised by Gen X, and being raised by Gen X is sort of like being raised by an older sibling who loves sarcasm and somehow made Fight Club a part of your moral education. So for me, when I was a kid, my parents weren't in their 40s, they weren't in their 50s. Like I have friends with boomer parents. My parents were really, really young, so like they basically raised me on Simpsons, South Park, grunge music, and they didn't really they said follow your dreams, but not in the same way that they did in school and the greater pop culture was at the time when I was 4 or 5. And I remember I'd put on Nevermind, the album by Nirvana, or I'd listen to Blood Sugar Sex Magic by the Red Hot Chili Peppers, or even Dookie by Green Day. And the reaction I got from my mom wasn't, oh God, you're listening to that punk music, that's terrible for you. But it was more, oh, I remember when I was your age. I remember when I was 20, 23, putting that stuff on the, putting that VHS on in my car or something. And I would listen to the music with my mom, and she would talk to me about the disillusionment of her generation. And one of the reasons I actually made the Gen X video on my main channel is because my mom would always tell me growing up, she's like, oh my God, Tantris, Gen Z is just Gen X all over again. It's terrible, the boomers screw you guys over too. And it was interesting because I was raised with a Daria kind of cynicism. And Gen X rightfully gets its criticisms, but it's just a different flavor of an older generation raising the new kids on the block. So with the boomer parents, they're faith in the system, their faith in reading everything from The Atlantic to watching CNN. My parents, from a very young age, where if people are trying to sell you something, be very skeptical of that. And it was always really cool to also share technological moments with my parents. My dad, for example, grew up in the late 80s and the early 90s, and he would play NES and SNES, and he would tell me cool stories of playing those old arcade games, I think it was called Golden Axe or something. And he'd talk about how when he was playing Metroid on the NES back in 1987 or 1988, he would just be alone in his room on the old crap CTR, or is it CRT television, enjoying his alone time. Whereas boomers didn't have video games. They were raised on Leave It to Beaver and records from the 60s. And Gen X definitely had their records too, but there was MTV and a very specific pop culture that I don't know, I took for granted. And then growing up, I started noticing in my friends that there was just a different cultural vibe their parents had, which my parents just definitely didn't. The American dream is still very much alive. You can still go to college and be successful. And with my parents, they would always be you probably should do that, but don't be surprised if you're not rich. Just survive. And it was a realism that they kind of embodied. And I don't know, the whole atmosphere that my mom's friends and my dad's friends kind of gave off was yeah, things are a little screwed. We definitely did not have as well as our parents, but we're still going to have a good time. And maybe part of that is because Gen X didn't have it quite as insane as Gen Z or even the millennials did. But my thesis is the millennials were more coddled than Gen Z was, or at least more coddled than Gen Z was, because the Gen Xers had their cynicism and they passed that on to many of the Zoomers. And this is actually one of the ways I think I have a lot in common with really young Zoomers, despite being an older Zoomer, is that young Zoomers definitely have more Gen X parents. The whole cynicism, the whole things are screwed, and then raised with technologically proficient moms and dads. But my childhood soundtrack was basically Nirvana, not nursery rhymes, and it was just really strange because there was no prosperity promised to me directly from my family and directly from the people around me. I only heard that in school or in the textbooks that we had when we the mid 2000s, which were probably still somewhat used in the 90s. Just really hard to get my head around it. But the boomer parents that I know, there's just there's an attachment to the media, an attachment to the message, or the boomer truth regime, as AA calls it, that, you know, just Gen Xers never really had. And I'm not calling Gen Xers geniuses by any means, but rather it's just there was never really anything to rebel against with the Gen Xers, because once I started doing it, my parents were like, yeah, we get it, you know. And that's why I think like a lot of the messages like Fight Club, Nirvana, and South Park, all of that is still very like resonant, still resonates with young Zoomers, because there was just like the planted seeds of that cynicism started with that generation. Slightly kind of you know, had less of an impact with millennials due to their boomer parents, and then Gen Z with, you know, a large amount of Gen X parents just like adopted that, and it grew into its own thing. But I don't know if there are any other Zoomers watching this. How old were your parents? You know, when you were born? Like I said, my parents were early 20s, and, you know, very much in the middle of the Gen X movement. And I don't want to say I'm proud of that. It's just a very unique experience that I think I need to expand on more in future videos, because we're always talking about boomers, or, you know, the millennials are considered uncool, or like Zoomers are still technically leading the youth culture, even though Gen Alpha is basically like going to replace us sometime soon. And then Xers, and I know there's always that Xer in the comments like, nobody gives a shit about Gen X, no one talks about Gen X. It's like, yeah, we all know there's like 100 of you to remind us, just to be, you know, funny about it. But it's true, you know, no one talks about Gen X quite as much as the other generations. And I'd like to, you know, bring it up a little bit more from the perspective of somebody who isn't Gen X but was raised by them. But that's about all. So, cheers.